my name's Danny Hopkins and I'm here at Britpart in Shropshire with Managing Director Paul Myers. Hello, Paul.
Hello.
We've got 4 items on the desk in front of us. Take us through the springs first. What are they for? What vehicles?
These fit Defender, Discovery 1, Range Rover Classic.
Excellent. And why would you want to fit them in particular?
These are both uprated springs, so they'll offer an increase in ride height, and also if a vehicle's been modified with a bumper for a winch or a roof tent, they'll handle the weight better.
Excellent. Okay, what have we got in front of those? The shock absorbers. Take us through those.
Yeah, on the left we've got the Old Man Emu shock absorber from Australia. It features improved valving and oil, so it actually increases the damping capacity of a shock absorber.
Brilliant. And the one on the right?
This is a standard replacement, as with the factory fit, perfect replacement for the shock absorber that's already on a car.
Perfect. Okay, so to see how to fit all these items, let's go and have a word with Martin in the workshop.
Suspension is one of the most important elements of your Land Rover, and it's really important that you make the right choice for your vehicle and what you use it for. If it's still got the standard springs on it that have been on it for years and years, chances are the ride will be crashy, it might lean over to one side and it will generally be tired. So when you're shopping for replacements, there's a few things to consider. First of all, it's how much weight you carry in your Land Rover. If you've got things like a winch and a winch bumper and you go camping a lot, you might have a roof tent, things like that, a standard height heavy duty upgrade can be a really good idea. These will also reduce body roll on the road because they're an uprated, stiffer spring than the standard items, and they're really good for towing as well. These Britpart dampers are a brilliant like-for-like replacement for the standard units, but if you're fitting a heavier duty spring, it's wise to upgrade the dampers as well. And that's where the Britpart Supergas dampers come in. This is one of a range of dampers that Britpart offer, and they'll be more than up to the job of looking after your suspension when you've got heavier duty spring fitted, keeping the vehicle under control, improving handling, and also giving you a better ride when you have got extra weight on board, such as a roof tent, a winch, things like that. So if you want slightly more ground clearance for off-roading, these upgraded Old Man Emu springs from Britpart are a fantastic idea. These come, as you can see, with a slight height increase over the original standard height heavy-duty springs, and these are available with dedicated Old Man Emu nitrocharger dampers. So as you'll notice, everything here, each spring has a damper to match it, and that's really important because if you fit heavier duty springs with a damper that doesn't quite have the correct valving, the rebound and compression to match it, the handling won't be as it should be, and you could notice the vehicle is bouncy to drive and doesn't handle well with load in it. So take that into consideration. So with that in mind, we're now going to head over to a Discovery 1 and fit a new set of springs and dampers. Okay, it's a really simple job to replace the front springs and dampers. There's just 4 nuts holding the turret to the top of the chassis. You need to undo those, they're 13mm nuts. You've then got a single nut on the bottom of the damper, which is a 17mm. Undo that, and then you'll be able to lift the whole suspension damper with the turret out through the engine bay. Once that's out, support the vehicle under the chassis, and you'll be able to withdraw the original spring from between the chassis and the axle. It's a possibility that you might need to compress the new spring if you are fitting lift springs, but it won't be very much, and there's plenty of room to work. Again, really important to make sure the chassis is supported correctly, and also that you've got something like a bottle jack or an axle stand under the axle itself to stop the axle dropping when you've undone the shock absorber nut. Once that nut's undone, you can carefully lower the axle slightly to disengage the damper from the spring plate. So these 4 studs that hold the turret to the chassis are attached to a turret ring, and you can either access these through the wheel arch or from inside the engine bay. So there's 4 nuts to undo that hold the turret to the top of the chassis. It's worth buying new turret rings as well, because if they're old and rusty, you sometimes snap the studs off. All those have come undone. So now the turret and the damper can be lifted out as one unit through the engine bay. There it is. All you need to do to swap the damper over to the turret is undo this top nut, reassemble with the bushings and the little washers in the right order, replace the spring, and then it's ready to go back together. So I've got the old damper removed from the turret, so we can now fit the new damper. And it comes with this little metal frame that holds it in position during transport, so I need to remove that first. Just compress it, unhook it, place it aside. And the bushes on these, you have the first plate goes on top, followed by one of the bushes, and then the locator sits on top of that. You then feed that up into the turret and do exactly the same on the top. So locator, then the bush, then the plate, washer, and finally the nut. And you can just tighten that up on the bench. So once you've got the nut and the whole assembly is in place, if you've got an impact gun, you can just use that to tighten the nut up. Like so. Just need it so that the nylock portion started to engage in the thread. And then we can set this aside while we change the spring. So because the old springs are standard height, we aren't going to need to compress them to get them out. They should just fall out under their own pressure. Okay, so with the axle drooping down, with a bit of pressure from a bar, just to get the spring over the spring plate bolts. You can then remove the spring from the vehicle. We might have to compress the new one because it is longer than this one, just to get it in place. It's also a good idea, as you can see, the turret ring has now come out. If you feed that back up through the chassis and secure it with a single nut, that will stop it dropping down and getting in the way when you're trying to fit the new spring. It's always worth noting when you fit new springs to see if they're handed, because some OE spec springs, they have one for the driver's side and one for the passenger side, so you need to make sure you get that the right way around. These have the same part number, so if you've got two that have the same part number but are slightly different in height, fit the slightly taller one on the driver's side just to compensate for the extra weight. Because they're a slightly heavier duty spring, but their free length isn't much longer than the standard ones, we're able to just slot them straight in without compressing them. If you're fitting something like a 2-inch lift spring, you might have to put spring compressors on the coils, pull them so they're slightly shorter to fit into place. So the nut can be removed from the turret ring again, now that that's now held in by the spring. Now we can fit the turret back in place with the new damper. And sometimes when you're fitting the dampers, you'll notice there's some small metal brackets holding wiring harnesses, anything like that, that slot over the top of the studs. So make sure you get them back in the right position. Just help feed that back into place. As you've got it sat in position but not tight, you then need to assemble the lower bush, and that's the same order as the top. So you've got a bush plate, followed by the bush itself, then the retainer, and then the pin will pass through the axle. Once you've got that in, you then repeat the process for the lower bush. So retainer, bush, plate, then the nut and washer. At this point, we're just raising the axle back up to make it easier to fit the bush onto the bottom of the shock absorber pin. It can be a bit fiddly to hold the retainer and the bush in place while you start the nut, but if you jack the axle up a little bit, it just brings everything closer together and makes it an easier job. Once you've got the nut started, you can lower the axle down and then fit and tighten the nuts for the turret plate. Once you've got all 4 turret nuts started on the threads, you can then tighten them down. You don't need to over tighten them because it's a fairly small thread and there's 4 of them. So the last thing to do before we move to the other side is just finish tightening up the shock absorber lower nut. It's important not to grip the damper with any sort of water pump pliers or Stilsons or anything like that, because if you scratch the paint, it can chip off and corrosion can start in the damper body. Once that nut's tight, just need to go over to the other side of the vehicle, do exactly the same thing, bolt the anti-roll bar back up if you have one, and you can move on to the rear. So just raising the axle up a little bit now to make sure the spring's located properly, top and bottom. That's all fine. So now we can move over, do the other side before moving on to the back. Okay, so with the front end done, we can move on to the rear. An even easier job. Again, when we fit the springs, we'll note that one of the springs in the kit is slightly taller than the other, and we're going to fit the taller one on the driver's side. So the first job we need to do is release the damper from the top chassis bracket and nut from the lower pin, so we can get that out of the way. If you're planning to reuse the dampers at any point, it's important not to grip them with anything metal while you're undoing the nut, otherwise they could be damaged or the tube could be crushed. If they're old and worn out, you can grip them with some big pliers and undo the nut. Can get a bit of corrosion on the threads, so treat them with penetrating oil beforehand and clean up the threads with a wire brush. They obviously do rust, and a lot of mud gets chucked about in the wheel arch, so it can be a little bit tricky to remove sometimes. As we explained before on the bench, this vehicle does have the bush cups fitted to the axle, so because we're only replacing them with standard length dampers, we're just going to arrange the bushes on here like so, with the washers pointing outwards and without using the retainer plates on the insides of the bushes. That will mean that the shock pin isn't overloaded and there's a much smaller chance of anything happening to it. As far as heavy off-road use, it'll allow more movement in the bushes. But again, if you're fitting longer dampers, it's important to remove the bush cups from the axle. So the damper is now released. Just got to remove the old bushes from the top pin and the lower axle bracket. And now we can move on to the spring. The spring's held in place on the axle with a single plate that's bolted down with 2 bolts, goes through the top of the spring cup onto a bracket on the axle tube. So we need to release those bolts first. Again, as with anything that's been in the wheel arch of a Land Rover, will have had a pretty hard life, so treat everything with penetrating oil first, clean it all up, and hopefully they'll come undone. Obviously, you're working through the coils as well. You're having to position the ratchet and socket through the holes, if you like, in the coil spring, so you have to experiment a little bit with extensions and socket lengths to get a good drive on the bolts. A ratchet spanner can also be helpful here. These are a 17mm bolt and nut on the axle bracket. Okay, it's the second bolt out. We can withdraw the nut, and then the retainer plate can come out as well. And with them out of the way, we can lower the axle down carefully using a bottle jack. And because these are standard height springs, they should pop out without too much aggravation. There we go, that's released from the top. So, easier to release it from the base first because there's less material for it to come past. And that's the old spring out the way. So the springs are fitted sometimes from the factory with these anti-squeak coverings that just go over one of the coils, and then this rubber ring goes in the top and insulates it from the chassis bracket just to stop any noises. So you can transfer that over to the new spring. Thank you. And then took slightly more effort to fit the new one just because slightly heavier duty and obviously a little bit longer than the original, but As long as the vehicle's securely supported and you've got something under the axle to catch it, it's not a problem. Now we just need to line up the holes in the spring plate with the holes on the axle, fit the spring retainer, put those bolts back in, and then we can move on to the damper. There's two little washers that fit between the spring plate and the retainer that just space it off the lower coil. So once everything's lined up, you can push the bolts all the way through, start the nuts by hand, and then tighten everything up. Might be necessary to give the spring a little turn like that just to make sure the retainer plate sits flat across the base of the coil. Once those bolts are tight, we can move on to the damper. And all we've had to do to prepare the damper to be fitted is push in the top bush, which is included in the kit. It's very easy to do. You can use a vise. You don't need to use a hydraulic press or anything to get that in place. Just remove the transit loop and then you can position it on the top pin. So once the damper's in place, we can jack the axle back up to meet it. Before we fit the other lower bush and then the washer and the nut. Okay, you don't want to go crazy over tightening the bottom pin because it does need some movement in it when the vehicle's going over rough terrain. With the damper attached to the top mount, we can fit the washers and the nut. And again, as with the lower pin, you don't want to over tighten that top nut, otherwise it will limit the ability of the damper to pivot on the pin, which is no good when the vehicle's going over rough terrain. There needs to be some movement there. So just nipping that up. So with everything in place, we can refit the road wheel and torque up the wheel nuts. So head to the Britpart website to check out the whole range of suspension packages that you can get for your Land Rover, and also check out the rest of the videos in the Britpart Workshop series.